Okay.
So let me firstly greet everybody. Good evening. To all our attendees, thank you for joining us for one more of our lecture as a part of the debrief webinar series. This is our attempt to use this free time to educate ourselves on issues which we don't come across in our day-to-day practice. These webinars are hopefully helping all of you keep yourself abreast about interesting topics and keeping yourselves occupied more importantly. As you all know, our speaker today is Ms. Gayatri Singh, who's a very well-known and well-renowned senior advocate from Bombay. She has been practicing in different forums since her enrollment in 1984. She's a part of the very well-respected Human Rights Law Network, and she has been representing a number of organizations in Maharashtra in matters relating to various social issues. Um, she will be speaking to us about perils to the public interest litigations in contemporary India. I emphasize the words to and not of, because in my opinion, there has been a concerted effort over the past few decades to illegitimize PILs. But we must always remember what was the purpose of PILs. So I now invite Ms. Singh to kindly deliver her talk on this issue.
Hello, everyone. Basically, the issue relating to perils to the PIL is a very vast topic. So and because of the shortage of time, I'll just restrict myself to specifically go into the issue of how courts have understood socio-economic rights in the context of PILs. And to understand that, we need to look at the entire history of PIL, which falls in different phases over a long period of time. Because in each phase, there are different issues that have been raised, and the courts have dealt with these issues differently. At times in support of socio-economic rights, at times restricting those rights, and at times expanding those rights. So the first phase, if you look at the first phase, it is, as everyone knows, it's the early phase of PILs, which basically fell from 1979 to the latter part of the 1980s, where basically the issue of locus standi became to the forefront, and the issue relating to whether an aggrieved person alone can file, or whether any other person who is not at all aggrieved or connected with the aggrieved person can file. And the courts held that any person could file, even if you're not connected with the aggrieved person or you're not filing in their representative capacity. So in that context, locus standi was broadened. But I would say that it was not really a revolutionary stand, because the Constitution at any rate provided for any person to file petitions under Article 32 and under Article 226. As long as you are able to show that there was violation of fundamental rights. So we already had a law, however, it was expanded by making it much broader. Secondly, the procedure itself was simplified. Therefore, a lot of people basically refer to PILs more in the context of procedural law and the changes that brought about it. But I think that there was also sort of from the beginning of, say, beginning of the 1980s, the entire issue of whether fundamental rights are more important or directive principles are more important, and the entire compartmentalization of fundamental rights and directive principles was how the courts looked at fundamental rights and directive principles. But during this period, the early phase of PILs, the court tried to link the socio-economic rights, which basically fell under directive principles, with fundamental rights. So you had basically issues being raised which were in some way or the other related to Article 21 or Article 23, which was bonded labor. And that's how the whole concept of Article 21 became broadened. to include many other aspects which fell within the right to life. So if we look at the issues that were raised at this time, the focus was more on specific causes of the impoverished, that is of the poor. So they were not really broad in that sense. They were more specific in respect of, say, the rights of prisoners under trials, and the emphasis was more on access to justice, where people were prevented from even coming to courts. So and the needs of the prisoners in terms of access to justice, speedy trial, then the issue relating to solitary confinement, to custodial violence, banning fetters, etc., etc. These were basic issues that came up, and it was more restricted to the 4 judges, who many have called as 4 musketeers. That was basically Krishna Iyer, Chinnappa Reddy, Desai, and Bhagwati. So in a sense, it really depended on the biases or prejudices or predilections of these 4 judges. The issue relating to, as I said, prisoners and bonded laborers, migrant laborers, were issues basically confined to the poor and the rights that they were entitled to. The courts did look at the issue of socioeconomic rights in that context. They did not restrict it to only directive principles and that you could not make it enforceable or justiciable. They did they started relating it to Article 21, which was basically right to life. One of the most important judgments at that time was of PUDR, which basically dealt with the issue relating to the bonded laborers and the fact that they were being treated, in the Asiad case, they were being treated as bonded laborers and were not being paid the minimum wages. The stand of the government was that minimum wages, we are unable to pay the minimum wages because of financial constraints, and therefore the issue of any violation of Article 23 does not arise. They also said that the issue of bigar, that is the concept of bigar, is really connected to forcible physical coercion, that is physically preventing some person to freely move about or to leave the employer's clutches. And the court said, no, this is the physical coercion is not the only criteria for determining whether it's bigar. It would also include economic compulsion. So in a sense, it broadened the socioeconomic rights to include basically socioeconomic rights, which were really looked upon as unenforceable rights. This basically was the early development of PIL, which also had its many pitfalls, in the sense that it basically restricted itself to what the state said it was obligated to do. So if the state said that, yes, we are bound by ABCD regulations or by the constitution, the court enforced that with regard to the state. PUDR was one of the few cases where it expanded it much beyond the state obligation. The second phase was really from 1990s to the middle of 2000, where it completely changed the entire focus. As far as the poor were concerned, it drastically reduced the filing of PILs on behalf of the poor. Basically, the courts were made to look at the issue of how do you balance competing interests. That is to say, for example, in Delhi, when 30% of the people were sought to be evicted from the city of Delhi, it was basically pitted against the poor, the slum dwellers who were residing within the city of Delhi, and the entire concept of cleaning up Delhi city. So these two issues, that is the poor versus the city, were pitted against one another, and it was the city that prevailed vis-a-vis the poor. The court could have gone into the issue of whether the poor even if they are to be removed, what was the alternative? Where would they be located? How would they be located? But the court did not go into that. It basically said that they had to be evicted. Similarly, with the issue of the Narmada dam, it was basically the tribals who were being evicted from that area. Thousands and lakhs of tribals were pitted against the dam, where it was made to look as if drinking water was of prime importance. And here again, the court came in favor of the Narmada Dam project, even though the Narmada project did not have an EC, only on the ground that this was a policy decision that the state had made, and therefore the court could not interfere, and so on and so forth. So during this period of time, there were, as I said, there were competing interests where the court had to balance one against the other, and it was basically the powerful and the strong who were favored vis-a-vis the poor. So you have cases like the Narmada Bachao Andolan in 2000, you have the N.D. Dayal case in 2003, which again dealt with the issue of dams, where a large number of tribals were evicted. Then you have the Tata Housing Development Corporation case versus Goa Foundation in 2003, where a housing project was to come up on forest land, depriving the fisher folk of their livelihood. Then you had, of course, the MC Mehta case in 1986, which went on, it still goes on till today, where courts have been passing orders on the issue of pollution, and in which there were industries which were relocated, affecting thousands of workers. So the courts did not go into the issue of infringement on the livelihood of the people who were going to be affected. It basically dealt with the project, saying that this was a policy decision that the government had made, and therefore it could not interfere. And then during this period, also you have what are known as the corruption cases. For example, the Vineet Narayan case, which everybody knows about, the Hawala case in 1998, where basically two lawyers and two journalists filed a case regarding the money that was being exchanged in Hawala terms to the politicians to favor the award of contracts to various contractors. So here again, the court really, in a sense, exceeded its jurisdiction by legislating, in the sense that it set up a committee to look into the functioning of the CBI, which in effect it had no powers to do. Yet it went into how the CBI should function, who the appointees were going to be, whether they were functioning in a proper way. So basically, carrying out a day-to-day supervisory power instead of leaving it to the executive in respect of the functioning of the CBI. Ultimately, the court directed that the two lawyers and two journalists, the lawyers representing the petitioners, should be removed and replaced with an amicus curiae who was a top-notch lawyer, and he basically represented the interests of the petitioners without even getting them involved in the arguments of the case. So ultimately, this is something that finally, even today, we are seeing the ramifications of the orders that were passed earlier with regard to amicus being appointed in important cases, where the court decides to hold the proceedings in camera, decides to replace the petitioners' advocates and replaces them with an amicus who basically argues a matter totally removed from the ground reality in terms of knowing what is actually happening at the ground level. So this was in respect to the corruption cases. There were a number of corruption cases at that time where the court basically set down guidelines in terms of implementation as far as the government is concerned. These guidelines were never followed with, and there was no monitoring over the functioning of the government with regard to the guidelines issued by the court. However, everything was not negative. There were many positive issues that came up during this period of time, and that was basically the development of the connection between directive principles and fundamental rights, and the fact that socio-economic rights were interpreted to be included in Article 21, which formed a part of Chapter 3 of the Constitution. This was an important development because for a long time, directive principles were not just justiciable, and they could not be enforced. Now, for the first time, the court started treating directive principles as part of fundamental rights, which became mainly part of Article 21. So in respect to this, I'd just like to deal with three major issues and to show the weaknesses in the court's orders and the strength in the orders passed with regard to these three issues. That is, the issue of right to shelter, right to education, and right to health. These are the three issues which would squarely fall under directive principles, and the courts would have normally said that we will not interfere in these because these are not justiciable. As far as the right to shelter is concerned, the most important case is that of Olga Tellis. As everyone knows, in 1986, the payment dwellers were to be evicted, and therefore Olga Tellis, a journalist who had nothing to do with payment dwellers, filed a petition, and basically the stand of the petitioners was that the right to shelter is a right to livelihood, which forms a part of right to life, and therefore they could not be evicted. The court upheld that argument and said that yes, the right to livelihood forms an integral part of right to life. The fact that the people have to be provided with a shelter is a fundamental right, and therefore Article 21 is applicable. Yet, unfortunately, the court did not really go in expounding what that right was. It did not explain what that right was. It in fact said that since the people were sought to be evicted on the basis of Section 314 of the BMC Act, which basically said that any encroachment could be removed without giving prior notice, that this action was arbitrary and that the BMC was required to give prior notice, and therefore the payment dwellers could not be evicted without first being heard and by giving a public notice. So the problem with this judgment was that though it was though it broadened the concept of socioeconomic rights by including it in Article 21, it in fact restricted itself only to the issue of procedure, that the procedure was not proper and therefore they must comply with the procedure and only then could they be evicted. So therefore the issue of shelter, what it is, how it should be implemented, what is the role of the government in implementing policies relating to shelter was never really gone into. A similar case relating to the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation case of 1997, again, was on the issue of shelter. But since the government had come up with a policy regarding eligibility of the slum dwellers, the court again restricted itself only to what the scheme was. What was the scheme that the government had was implementing, and said that only the eligible people who were provided under the scheme could be provided with shelter. So it did not deal with much broader issue relating to the right to shelter. The second issue with regard to right to education, the two most important cases with regard to right to education was Mohini Jain's case and Uni Krishnan's case. PIL was filed challenging the government notification issued by the Karnataka government which said that capitation fee could be charged by the private colleges. The court held that this was violative of Article 21, and that the right to education flows from the right to life under Article 21, and therefore the state could not allow private colleges to charge capitation fees. This judgment was basically where basically the judges confirmed the finding that yes, right to education was part of right to life, but narrowed it down by saying that it was restricted only within the four corners of the directive principle, which was basically Article 45, which said that free education could be provided to children up to the age of 14 years, and Article 41, which said that any free limits of economic capacity. So the court said that it could be that free education could be given only to children up to the age of 14 years, and this was subject to economic viability or capacity of the government. This was contrary to what was argued and what was confirmed by the Moini Jain's case, which basically said that education was a right. It narrowed down the right and said, and instead of saying that the right was applicable to every, government said that was basically saying that it was applicable only up to the age of 14, and only if the government had financial capacity. And finally, we come to the issue of right to health, which is basically along the similar lines of right to shelter and right to education, in the sense that many of the cases that were filed, basically the main argument was that right to health formed part of right to life under Article 21. But unfortunately, the courts did not go into that issue, even though they said that yes, right to health is a fundamental right. For example, in the case of Vincent Pannikura Langara, which is of 1987, the PIL that was formed was basically to stop the distribution and sale of unsafe drugs and ask for the withdrawal of certain drugs which were unsafe. However, the court did not go into this issue, saying that this was a technical issue, and therefore the courts could not go into it. Whereas the court could have gone into the issue of whether the regulations that had been issued under the Drugs Act was challengeable, or whether any changes or modifications could have been made in the regulations itself. It did not touch on any of those issues. Similarly, in the case of Rakesh Chandra Narayan of 1989, in this case, a letter was submitted by Rakesh, giving details of the deplorable conditions of a hospital in Bihar for mentally challenged people. The court passed several orders, interim orders, saying that they should improve the conditions. The fans were broken, the beds, there were no proper beds, there was no proper toilets, etc., etc. And instead of implementing these orders, nothing was done, and therefore the court appointed chief judicial magistrate to look into it. The magistrate submitted, the reason why I think this incident is because subsequent to this, meaning over a period of many years, there have been similar cases where courts appoint committees, then the committee submits a report, the report narrates all the deplorable conditions in the homes, and then the court issues guidelines, and yet nothing is done with regard to scrutiny or with regard to monitoring of the homes by the government. There are no specific directions issued to the government for compliance of the rules and the applicable law. and therefore it remains, basically these guidelines remain in the air with absolutely no implementation. Therefore, even with regard to monitoring and implementation, the courts have failed in ensuring that their orders are implemented. When we come to the present situation, we find that many of the issues that have been raised earlier are now being brought out much more boldly and to the detriment of people who have been fighting for their socioeconomic rights. For example, many of the judgments that have recently been passed have either overruled a full bench judgment, or two judges have overruled the judgment of, say, 5-judge bench, and without any qualms, these total contrary positions are being taken, basically depending on who the judge is and who's heading the bench. So you find that in the national anthem case, I think many people frequently quote this because this is a most blatant case where neither is there any violation of any law, nor is it that there is a law that needs to be implemented. Basically, someone filed a PIL saying that the cinema halls everyone should stand up and recite the national anthem in the cinema halls. The courts refused to, there were 2 benches who refused to entertain this petition. And finally, this was taken away from that bench, and a bench of 2 judges basically said that, yes, you must sing the national anthem in the theaters, and that became the law, which was basically legislating where the courts are not empowered to do that. The other issue about local standard, the local standard has become so broad that anyone can file, which is fine. Anyone should be able to file. But then there is a rider to that anyone who files must be able to show that there is a violation of fundamental rights. If there is no violation, the petitions normally should be dismissed, but that is not what happens. And several petitions have now been filed by individuals who have absolutely no locus. For example, in the case of Lawyers Collective, a petition was filed by an organization called Lawyers Voice. And basically, they came to court saying that an SIT inquiry should be constituted into the functioning of Lawyers Collective. Now, neither did they file any application, nor did they bring on record what was the violation. Why was it that SIT should be formed? For what purpose was it to be formed? The people to be affected were not at all heard, and the court passed an order saying that the CBI will carry out its work without any interruption, which is basically giving a green signal for them to carry out the investigation. The other, I mean, I can go on and on, but the other most glaring sort of what I would say is that the courts have really taken upon themselves. PIL has become a weapon in the hands of the judiciary, which has absolutely no accountability. So a judiciary which has no accountability can do more harm than good by siding with certain individuals whom they feel are doing the right job and passing orders against people, thereby violating their fundamental rights. For example, one important case that came up in connection with pollution in Delhi was the case of MC Mehta, which was lying in limbo for many, many years. Finally, the court decided that we will bring it out in the open and hear the matter. This pertained to the pollution in Delhi due to burning of stubble in Punjab, Haryana, and UP. Now, the basic principles of natural justice are that when you pass an order against any individual or any organization, they should be heard. However, in this case, the farmers who were to be affected, because it was the farmers who were burning the stubble in those villages for various reasons. The reasons were both related to farming as well as relating to economic reasons. They were never heard. No proposal as to why this stubble burning was being done, for what reason, how could it be controlled, in what manner could it be controlled, could everything be stopped or could it be done in phases? Nothing was discussed. The court just in one hearing came to the conclusion that the pollution was due to stubble burning, and therefore the farmers should be directed to stop the burning, and if anyone indulges in burning, the coercive action and penal provisions will be applied against those farmers. So here was a blatant case where coercive action was initiated by the court without hearing the affected people. And now we come to the issue of the present situation where we have the COVID facing us, and several petitions have been filed, as everyone knows, before the High Courts and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, unfortunately, has taken a stand where it has stood by the government and said, in view of the crisis, in view of the extreme health crisis pervading the country, it is necessary to lie low and not take any action or file cases, particularly when the government is going through a difficult time. And the government files an affidavit saying that everything is fine, there's no problem at all the migrant workers are being taken care of, there's food being supplied, they are being provided with relief benefits, etc., etc. And the court basically accepts it. So in a petition which was filed by Harsh Mandar and various other people, where they said that the wages of the construction workers should be paid because they have worked during that period of time, and today they are idle because due to no fault of theirs, that the wages must be paid according to law. The court comes up with the argument that since the government says that food is being provided to migrant workers, it is not necessary to pay wages to the workers. So food is sufficient, irrespective of the fact that most of the relief centers have no food, that the food is stale, and no proper food or relief facilities are being provided to the migrant workers. So there have been a number of cases. In Bombay High Court also, we have filed number of cases, yet the court is reluctant to even deal with the issue of violation of fundamental rights, where a large number of migrant workers are affected by, just recently, about 10 to 15 workers were just, train just went over them and killed all 15 of them. Nobody's shocked by the situation. Nobody's shocked by the fact that workers have to walk miles from their hometown. Why are they leaving Bombay? It's because they don't have the facilities. They have not been looked after. No food is being given. No medicines are given. There's no testing being done. And so therefore they have left their whatever little belongings they have here to walk all the way to their villages. And many have died on the way. At least till today, we've heard that at least 45 people have died from traveling. And the court basically says that everything is fine because the government is saying that everything is fine and there is no violation of fundamental rights. So I just end with this, that there are definitely perils to PIL, but it is also because of the attitude and the approach of the courts with regard to the fundamental rights of the poor and those who have no way to defend their rights. And unless there is accountability given to the judiciary, situation will get from bad to worse. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Just a couple of questions which have come in. One question which comes in is about, they asked for your opinion about guidelines for PL. Do you feel that it is necessary to lay down some sort of guidelines in relation to PLs?
I don't think so, because basically the guidelines are more in terms of the procedural aspect, and the procedural aspect is making it even more difficult for the poor to file cases. In fact, if we look at the workload of the courts, it is said that it is because of the PILs that there is increase in in cases that are being filed, and there's delay in justice being given, which is absolutely false, because PILs form basically only 1 to 2% of the total workload. In fact, if we look at the Supreme Court docket, we find that the SLPs which are filed are about 87%. So the SLPs filed by people who can afford it, and it is also mainly from the rich states, basically Punjab, Haryana, and these states where the maximum number of petitions SLPs are filed. So this argument that the PILs are taking up so much of court's time, that they are wasting court's time, is absolutely bogus. And therefore, according to me, there's absolutely no need for guidelines to be issued. There might be few cases where whom you can refer to as bad cases, in the sense that there might be people who file cases just to extract money or extort money from builders or whatever it is. But these are just a handful of such cases. You cannot apply the same yardstick to all PILs.
Another question which has come in is about your comment for accountability of the judiciary. Can you give your inputs in how this accountability can be brought about?
In PILs?
Yes.
Then they must go strictly by what the basic point. Most of the cases where orders have been passed recently by the High Court are basically orders which have exceeded the principle that no PIL can be filed unless you can show that there is a violation of a fundamental right. Therefore, as I said, even in the case of Loya case of 2018, where basically a PIL was filed by a number of people, and the court said they have no locus standi to file that. But isn't that sort of inconsistent with the position that they've taken for other cases where people who have absolutely no locus, who have no concern with the issue, have filed cases just to extract certain political benefits from the court? So I would say that the accountability is in terms of following the Constitution, which is basically ensuring that the courts see whether there is any violation of fundamental rights, whether it's socio-economic rights or whether it's political and civil rights, which is not what's happening today.
Ma'am, another common theme of questions that we are getting is about the principle of res judicata in relation to PILs. Can you elaborate a little on that?
So res judicata would mean that if a case similar to the case filed in PIL has been filed, adjudicated, heard, and an order passed, only then would res judicata apply. So I'm not able to understand the question, because is that person saying that in a case, in a matter where a writ petition is filed and some orders are passed and a PIL on the similar issue is filed, then definitely res judicata would apply. But if the issue is different, the people concerned are different, and no orders have been passed on that, then definitely a PIL can be filed.
Sorry, just a follow-up question to this, ma'am. These days, there is a tendency to rush to the courts and file public interest litigations, and essentially then, even if one has good motives and intentions, damaging the case. So in that context, I think that is what the context in which people are asking about res judicata. So if a shoddily drafted or a shoddily argued PIL is filed, and there the court refuses to interfere, then would a more comprehensive public interest litigation suffer because of this sort of race to the court?
That's true. Yes, it would. It would. But the point is that such cases are really, we can't predict which will draft it. So if a case of the only way out is to show that these issues that were raised, certain other issues are also being raised, and the reliefs that are sought are different from that petition.
One last question, ma'am. It's a very interesting one. What do you think the role of an amicus curiae or committees which are appointed by courts in PILs? What is their role? And can you think of a situation where, or think of an instance where the committee or the amicus has really helped the cause and gone beyond the call of duty to sort of push the cause through?
I would say there are many such cases, but for example, the Godavarman case, which is basically a case which has been in the High Court where an amicus was appointed and number of positive orders were passed in that. It has helped a number of people and organizations all over the country. So I'm not against amicus. All that I was saying was that at times when a petitioner files a case and an advocate is appointed by that person, the petition, the court decides to take that petition seriously because it raises serious issues. So therefore, the amicus, because I have seen many cases where amicus have been appointed and then they take over the entire case without even discussing with the petitioner, who might have done all the legwork and all the research work in trying to understand the situation, or even in terms of contacting people or being in touch with the local people who are affected, whereas an amicus might not be. So you might have an amicus who might be a legal pundit, or he might be good at his law and he's able to sharply present all the issues. But at the same time, he might be lacking in respect of the practical issues which people face and how to overcome those, because just a legal solution to the problem is not going to help. It's also the practical implications of that has to be looked into. So there must be a combination of the two, the amicus with the petitioners or with the petitioner's advocates. The petitioner's advocate might be a novice, or he or she might be not so well equipped in law. But at the same time, I don't think we should underestimate those people. We need to take them together so that a much more constructive order and implementable order is passed. As far as committees are concerned, unfortunately, most of these committees which have been constituted by the Supreme Court or by the High Courts, really, I mean, the court spends so much of time by getting expert opinion, or a person who is an expert is heading that committee. He or she spends millions of hours just looking into that issue, preparing guidelines, but none of them get ultimately implemented. So you had a committee for the ashram shalas, where the ashram shalas suggested certain ways and means of improving the situation. Nothing happened. In fact, the situation went from bad to worse. So how do the courts make the government accountable? Something that needs to be done much more vigorously, instead of just appointing committees and then just leaving it for the committee to implement it, which never really happens.
Thank you, ma'am. I think there are a few more questions, but because of time, I won't be able to put them to you right away. Thank you so much for taking us through this jurisprudence relating to PIs. You did start off by saying that it's a vast topic and the time may not be sufficient, but we feel that you've certainly given us sufficient pointers to enable us to research this aspect of law by ourselves. It certainly gives us food for thought. So let me thank you once again for coming on our platform and delivering this lecture. We really appreciate it. And we hope you remain safe during this situation.
Thanks.
The last time we spoke, you said that your building was under lockdown, but we hope your spirits high.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Entirely our pleasure, ma'am. For all our attendees, this webinar will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to it. If you go to the YouTube website, and search for Debrief Conversations. You will find our channel. Please also follow us on Facebook. Again, there we are Debrief Conversations. And on Instagram and Twitter, we are at Debrief Legal. You following us will help you stay up to date about all our future events. We have also posted in the chat box about our WhatsApp group, which you can sign up to and remain updated about our future events. So thank you all for joining this webinar. Our next webinar is in a very short duration. It's going to be tomorrow morning. It is going to be conducted by Justice Sriram of the Bombay High Court on Admiralty Law and Practice. So we hope that you can join us for that as well. With this, we're signing off. Thank you very much. Hope you had a fruitful webinar.